welcome to this evening's Ideas Exchange.
When these conditions arise, we arise too.
And I think that sometimes limitation is good for artistry and good for creativity.
You're at a situation where you're like, well, is it worth it?
You cannot be an effective leader if you shortchange yourself.
I love asking why. That is my favorite question to ask, is just the why.
Take that passion and do something great with it. Save the world.
I don't have any more secrets. And that is a wonderful way to go through life.
Thank you all for watching this story, video, post, whatever this is. Thank you so much. Bye.
Hi, I'm Jeff Bercovici, Deputy Business Editor for the LA Times. Thank you all for tuning into this edition of Ideas Exchange, the LA Times series where we invite some of the best creative thinkers to join us for a conversation about their work. Our guest tonight is Guy Raz, journalist, radio host, podcasting pioneer, and now author. Guy started his career in radio as an award-winning foreign correspondent and war reporter before co-creating some of public radio's best-known programs, TED Radio Hour and How I Built This. His newest show, Wisdom from the Top, brings listeners inside the minds of some of the world's most powerful and influential business leaders. His new book, How I Built This, The Unexpected Paths to Success from the World's Most Inspiring Entrepreneurs, offers priceless insights and inspiration from the world's top founders on how to start, launch, and build a successful venture. Signed copies are available from our bookselling partner, Pages, a bookstore. Now, please join me in welcoming Guy Raz. Hi, Guy.
Hello, Jeff. Thank you, first of all, for the introduction. And thank you for doing this, because I have been in your window in the past as a moderator, and it is a lot of work. And moderators don't ever get acknowledged. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you especially for joining us from your, from what I understand is your closet.
Temporary closet, yes. I normally work out of a production studio in the East Bay in Northern California. But I am temporarily in Las Vegas. And I think if anyone is watching in California now, you can understand why I'm here. My kids were stuck at home for so many days. So about 10 days ago, we decided to decamp for a few days, but we're going to head back to the Bay Area shortly. So we're excited.
Great. Guy, I was hoping that you could start. There's a story in your book that's just extraordinary. Could you start by telling people who are watching the story of Gary Hirshberg and Samuel Kamen and what they went through in starting Stonyfield Farm and turning it into a successful business?
I mean, this is one of my favorite stories because it is, people ask me often, tell me about failure. Give me an example of failure. And Stonyfield yogurt is basically a litany of failures over almost a 10-year period. Gary Hirshberg had this dream of making incredible yogurt. I mean, it's hard to imagine now when you can go to the grocery store and find wonderful yogurts from many different manufacturers, you know. But there was a time where to get that really high quality yogurt, you had to make it yourself. And I'm a yogurt maker, so I love making yogurt, and I still make it today. And by the way, if you have an Instant Pot, I can tell you how I do it. And he wanted to produce great yogurt that was organic, that would be available to consumers. But it really was a slow burn. First of all, it's a very expensive endeavor. It requires dairy cows. It requires a farm. It requires a facility to make the yogurt and then to package it. And in the early days, Gary and Sam were doing this themselves. You know, they were packing the yogurt into jars and in plastic tubs and distributing it to, you know, small little grocery stores in New Hampshire and then eventually in Massachusetts. And really, it was, I mean, just a series of really dramatic moments in building this business. I mean, at one point, the cows weren't producing enough milk. At one point, they lost the lease on the dairy farm and they had to move to a new farm. The machinery would break all the time. Eventually, they partnered with another dairy farmer who also was quite a wealthy businessman who tried to kind of pull the business out from under them. They went bankrupt several times. He was going back to any investor that he could find, including his mother-in-law that he was calling in the middle of the night, begging for a line of credit, another $10,000 here and there. It eventually got to the point where they were so desperate, they just they thought it was going to collapse, but they got a small business loan. I mean, this was just a litany of failures and crises and moments of literally lying on the bathroom floor crying in the fetal position until they eventually turned a corner. What's interesting about that story is even in the midst of all that crisis and struggle and kind of debilitating fear sometimes, what Gary Hirshberg was able to see was a trajectory. So even though they were losing tons of money every year, he could see that more and more, slowly but surely, as he would distribute the yogurt and get better distribution agreements with grocery stores in the Northeast, he could see how more and more people were actually, buying his product and learning about it. And it was, and so that to him was a sign that this thing could work. But it's one of the many examples in the book that I use really to show, that building a business involves tremendous struggle, tremendous failure, and requires tremendous perseverance. And, the story of Gary Hirshberg is probably like one of the best examples out of all of the entrepreneurs I've ever interviewed or had on my show or are in this book.
Okay, so you sort of glanced on this, but what's the difference between a story like that, between what Gary Hirshberg did, and just having terrible judgment? I mean, he was wrong for a long time before he was right, and even after they made the change to their business that you attribute to being the sort of hill that they summited, and things started to work after that. They were still losing money for a long time after that, a couple of years.
They were still losing money. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I often think about this question, which is, when do you know to pivot? When do you know to give up? When do you know to keep pushing forward? And unfortunately, there's no scientific answer to that question. But let me give you one example. One of my really most favorite entrepreneurs in the United States is a guy named Tristan Walker. And Tristan he wanted to create a better razor specifically for Black and brown men. Why? Because a Gillette blade with 5 blades shaves too close under your skin. And so for men who have very curly hair, it results in what's called razor bumps. Your hair grows back into your beard, and it's very painful and creates scarring. And while Tristan Walker was growing up, he noticed that the only razors for men who looked like him were found in the dusty ethnic aisles of the pharmacy or the grocery store. And he wanted to produce a razor that was beautiful, that had an unboxing experience that was like an iPhone. I mean, he literally was inspired by the iPhone box with that swoosh sound. He went to tons of investors to pitch them on this idea. Well, of course, the answer he heard again and again was, is there a market for this? Who's going to buy this? I mean, is this really a problem? Well, yeah, because he knew it was, and most of the investors he was talking to were not Black or brown folks. What Tristan knew, and why he persevered, and he did eventually raise money, and it took a long time for his business to really take off. And then even once it took off, he was struggling. But he knew viscerally that this was a product that had to be out in the world. And he believed it so fundamentally because he knew that it solved a problem for him and for millions of Black and brown men and women who use razors. And he knew that if he couldn't actually succeed, if he couldn't make this product work, then nobody could, because there was no market for it. But because he was so convinced, he was able to persevere despite years and years of losing money. And eventually, he was bought by Procter & Gamble, and now it's a subsidiary of Procter & Gamble and a very successful brand. It's available at Target and everywhere. But it's an example of the difference between folly and perseverance. It's when you know that the thing that you are offering, the product or service, is something the world has to have and really solves a problem for you and many people, then the answer is easy. You know that you've got to keep pushing.
So when did you know that you wanted to do How I Built This? Your birth as an entrepreneur corresponded with your becoming the guy who interviews entrepreneurs. So what changed? What sent you down this path?
I think for me it was, and I think for a lot of entrepreneurs who start their career, as you know, Jeff, most first-time entrepreneurs are not 22-year-olds eating ramen. That's a myth. The vast majority of entrepreneurs are roughly 39, 40 years old. And actually, that's the average age of a first-time entrepreneur. So half are older, half are younger. And in my mid-30s, I already had about 12 years of reporting experience under my belt. And as you know, with time, with the passage of time and experience, you become more confident in what you do and what you can do. It's still scary. It's always scary to take a leap. But once I felt like it wasn't dangerous, because there's a big difference, and I talk about this in the book, between doing something that is dangerous, which is like jumping out of an airplane without a parachute, and something that is scary, which is jumping out of an airplane with a certified, guide and a parachute. That's probably not dangerous, but is scary. You can do scary things. And so for me, it was a matter of getting to a point in my life where I sort of had this, a bit more confidence that came with experience and work, knowing that, if it didn't work out, if this show didn't work out, I could try something else because I had the experience in this world. I could pivot and try something else. So it really was a matter of for me, it was a matter of time.
So here's a scary thing, doing any kind of business in this environment that we're in. One thing that I hear a lot as a business journalist who covers tech startups is examples of famous companies that started right during the dot-com crash or started right during the financial crisis. And a lot of investors will say, they think that the strongest companies come out of the hardest times. What's your perception of that from the people that you've talked to? Is this as terrible in a business environment as this feels like? Is this a great time to start a company, or is that is that overthinking it?
It's actually a great time to start a company, as counterintuitive as it seems. I mean, think about the area that you cover a lot, which is Silicon Valley. You know that Hewlett-Packard built Silicon Valley. That business was founded in 1936, in the midst of the Great Depression. Now, who was starting businesses in the midst of the Great Depression? You can go on and on. Microsoft, FedEx, Slack, Airbnb, Uber, etc. Betterment. These companies started in the financial crisis. Microsoft in 1973, an economic downturn. FedEx, started during an economic downturn. The point is that, and I think the reason why investors talk about the opportunities in a downturn is that a downturn forces you to be resourceful. It forces you to be very careful and methodical about what you have, how you spend it, and what you focus on. And the other side to it is that if you accept that there's nowhere else to go except up, that if we are essentially at a low point, and we may be at this low point for quite some time, then if you are essentially able to begin to build the foundation of a business, a small business now, you are essentially building resilience into the fabric of your business. Because when we emerge from this, you will still face challenges in the future. I mean, Airbnb was started in the financial crisis, okay? They went to, this story, it's in the book. They went to 20 investors looking for funding for their business in 2008. And they sent out emails to 20 investors, and 10 replied, and 5 agreed to meet for coffee. And for $150,000 in 2008, you would have owned 10% of Airbnb, and not a single investor invested. Now, it took almost a year and a half before they were able to get seed funding, and that really came because they got into Y Combinator. The point is that Airbnb in March, okay, when COVID hit, they saw a 65%, I think almost 80% decline in their revenue in like 3 weeks. It was dramatic. And Jeff, you'll remember this. If you watched cable news and business channels, people were saying Airbnb was toast, that this business was done, and that this crisis was going to kill Airbnb. Well, a couple things. They raised some cash. They were very careful with cash. Of course, they had to have layoffs. But now, 6 months on, Airbnb is back, actually is exceeding their revenues compared to last year at this time. And on top of that, I would argue that Brian Chesky, the CEO and the co-founder, was not, it's not to say that this is easy. This is an incredibly challenging time for him. And he's been on the show recently to talk about it. They had resilience built into their business because they started their business at a time when nobody wanted to give them any money, and they had no money. And they had to be very, very careful with how they started the business. So in some ways, the origin story of that company kind of prepared them better to withstand this crisis. And so I think that's very true. You look at Shopify, for example. Shopify is a business where it's a platform where you can put up an e-commerce store and sell whatever you want to sell. Well, in 2008, Toby Lutke, who founded that company, he was freaking out because he thought they would lose tons and tons of business to to the contrary. They saw a 2,000% increase in people onboard and new onboarding, people joining Shopify because people were losing jobs, and lots of people thought, well, I might as well try to sell something online, or might as well, Etsy. And Shopify today now have seen huge spikes in the number of people joining those platforms because A, some people are out of work, and B, some people are using this as an opportunity to see if they can launch something. So it seems very odd to launch a business in the middle of a crisis, but in some ways, it actually, when you think about it, makes a lot of sense.
Let's talk about Airbnb for a second. So you go into, you sort of dissect the origins of their success. You put your finger on a number of things that helped them thrive, different points where they solve different problems or turn corners. But one thing that doesn't come up is how they have, one advantage that they always had built in is that they're essentially renting rooms to people as hotel rooms without, for a long time in their history, having to pay a hotel tax. So an Airbnb was effectively cheaper than a hotel. That's the kind of thing that a Brian Chesky isn't going to want to say in a public interview, because among other things, he might be subject to ongoing litigation or regulatory action. How, when you're talking to the people who run the companies, in their own words, how how do you get inside problems like that? How do you really fully understand a company when you're looking through that pinhole of the founder's vision?
Look, How I Built This is both an incredibly inspiring show and an inherently flawed show, because we're not a documentary. It's a single person's perspective, usually one person, sometimes two if they're co-founders, on the founding of their business. It's an oral history. Oral history is incredibly important. It's part of the historical record, but it's not the whole story. It's not documents and the definitive final full story, but it is an important story and a real story. My job when I bring people on, there are a couple things I would say. The first is I have one condition when I interview people. If you want to be on How I Built This, we don't accept conditions. We have to be able to ask you everything that we want to ask you, because our listeners and my readers expect that. And the second thing is that, we don't chase people to be on the show. If you're going to be on the show, we want people who want to be on the show, which means that they have to be willing to be open. I do an extensive amount of reading and research before I interview every person. We do about 45 full-length episodes of How I Built This every year, and then another 100 episodes called the Resilience series, which are very short little pops that we launched earlier this year, where we're talking to businesses about how they're pivoting and building resilience during this time. But on the main episodes, I usually do between minimum 4 to sometimes 10, sometimes many more hours than that, reading everything that is available, both public and non-public information about the people I interview, because my job is to, and my team's job is to make sure that these are not hagiography, that this is, that we are also talking about the warts and all, and the challenges and the downsides and the controversies. I mean, what we're trying to show is that there's no such thing as a perfect business or a perfect human. It's just impossible. I mean, we work really hard on the show and in the book to screen for people who we believe represent the best of entrepreneurship. In part because our show and what we do has come to represent entrepreneurship in the minds of our listeners. And so our job, and we really take this seriously, is to showcase the best of it. And if you listen to who's on the show, or if you read about who's in the book, it's very obvious that we are screening for people with integrity, people who treat their employees well, people who try and do the best they can and try and be ethical business leaders. Now, are they always hitting it out of the park? No way. None of us do. We're all flawed. And that's the point of the show, right? I mean, part of the show is to show people in a 360-degree view. I want people to talk about their flaws and their mistakes and also their, lapses in personal judgment, because that's part of the human story. And these are human stories, and no one is perfect. And our job is to showcase that, because I think we can all identify with imperfections as well.
Now there's you said people with integrity, people who treat their employees well. There's one of the entrepreneurs who's featured in the book a fair amount, Steph Corey, the CEO of Away. Subsequent, probably, I'm guessing, to when you finished writing the book, because this was just in the last few months, she stepped down for a time. I think she might have resumed her job, but after a fairly damaging report about how essentially, I guess you'd call it bullying at the company. I mean, this is something where it's got to be hard to really, I guess, what are you doing when you say that these are people who have integrity? Like, how are you?
Let me address that.
Can
I address that exact example?
Please, yeah.
We interviewed Jen Rubio on the show, who's the co-founder of Away, and she was, and I know her well, and she is a beloved leader of that company, and I know that because it's all out there. And in the book, the way we talk about Steph Corey and Jen Rubio is how they actually spent months, almost a year, researching an industry to figure out how to be disruptive in the travel industry. It's a really important facet of understanding how to create a business, because Jen Rubio, the story of Away was she had a suitcase that would break all the time, right? And so she decided, having had experience working at Warby Parker and other companies, that she wanted to disrupt this industry. And she partnered with Steph Corey to build Away. And they spent a year researching the industry, really canvassing people to find out what they wanted in suitcases. This is crucial. It's absolutely crucial. Now, what I talk about in the book and what Jen talked about on the show was that Steph Corey focused on logistics and on the supply chain. She was an expert in the supply chain logistics. And Jen really focused on culture and on representing the business. Now, the fact of the matter is, we, as I say, we do screen for the things I talked about. If you listen to the interview with Jen Rubio, it's pretty clear. I mean, she is, I can't speak to the what happened at Away with Steph Corey. I don't personally know her. But I think that the way they built that business and how they really built buzz around that brand is incredibly important and instructive for anybody who's looking to start a business or who wants to be inspired by people who do, which is why we make this show and why we put these stories out there.
Do you, the people who find enormous success as entrepreneurs, there are certain personality characteristics or types that pop up again and again. A famous one. They're very driven. Often perfectionistic, and there are certain types of excesses or cultural pathologies that sometimes, particularly in Silicon Valley, my reporters find themselves writing about a lot. Abuse, harassment, sometimes breaking of the law. Do you think that those two things, is there a relationship between those? Is there something about the defiance of limits or the intensity that these people bring to their jobs that sometimes spills over into things you don't want?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I don't have a whole lot of experience with that on how I built this. I mean, in part because, look, we primarily, what we focus on is our consumer goods. I mean, very few of our interviews, I mean, you probably know Silicon Valley better than I do, because very few of our episodes have been about tech companies, probably only about 10%. Most of what we focus on are things that people make, Stacy's Pita Chips or Tate's Cookies. And it's hard for me to kind of assess whether there's a psychological connection between, entrepreneurs and people who, are cutting corners, because I just don't. I just haven't experienced that. I think that's true. I've seen a lot of journalists who do that, Jeff. I mean, in my time, I covered 6 wars. Okay, I saw a lot of journalists cutting corners and behaving in ways that actually offended my own sense of ethics. So I think that applies to all kinds of professions. And we really do try hard on how I built this, as I say, to focus on business leaders who are, as far as we can tell in our research, representing integrity as best they can.
Here's a question, something that I found really fascinating reading the book. There's a chapter about location, whether it's better to be in the place that is the center of where your competitors and your customers and your talent will be located. You know, whether that would be being in New York if you're certain types of businesses, in LA maybe if you're an entertainment business, or whether it's better to be out on the periphery. And the thing that I found so fascinating is that the people you talk to inevitably, it seems, identify their success, identify where they started the business as a component of their success. Now, I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about your take on that question, but also just more broadly, how you deal with the issue of survivorship bias. When everyone you're talking to is very successful, you know, they came through all these different kinds of gates to get to where they are. How you decipher what actually contributed to their success from what is basically a just so story that they tell?
Well, I mean, I think it's a good question. Look, I think that there are a lot of factors that are beyond analysis, right? And one of those is luck. You know, sometimes a business. I mean, you know, Shopify is a terrific example. It's a business that really exploded and grew, and it was created by Toby Lutke because he had a snowboard shop online and couldn't find any good off the shelf software to create a beautiful store. So he made it himself, and really he just wanted to sell snowboards, right? But so many people contacted him and asked him where he got the software, and his answer was, "Well, I made it," and that was really the beginnings of Shopify. He decided to create that business in Ottawa, Canada. He's German. His fiancée at the time, now wife, was Canadian, who lived in Ottawa, was a diplomat, and wanted to live there. And every time he went to Silicon Valley looking to raise money, the answer was the questions he got from investors were, okay, when are you going to move your business out here? Because this is where the action is. And what he discovered was that by actually keeping it in Ottawa, it enabled him to avoid being distracted by the craziness of Silicon Valley and to really focus on the product and on the team. And the second thing he realized was that there's an incredible talent pool there. Ottawa is a little bit like Washington, D.C. in that it attracts very smart, very talented people. Obviously, it's a seat of government in Canada. And from Ottawa, he could really draw this incredible talent pool. Now, I will add, there is a slight twist to this today, which is we're living at I mean, here I am remote, you're remote, everyone's working remotely. So I think it's an open question as to how location will impact a brand in the post-COVID era. And how location will also impact, these sort of secondary cities or third tier, quote unquote, third tier cities in the United States and in Canada that have not benefited from, this talent pool, right? And I think that's an interesting question to see where, new businesses will emerge out of, or where new centers of innovation will be. I mean, it could be in places that traditionally were left behind, like Boise or Omaha, Nebraska, or Binghamton, New York, or Rochester. Places that at one point during the industrial age were really important centers of innovation. That may happen again, and so the whole question of location, in some ways, as we look forward to the post-pandemic era, could be entirely turned on its head, which is actually, I think, incredibly exciting.
So I used the term survivorship bias in my last question. I realized I should have defined it for people who are watching. Basically, it's when you're talking to a subset of entrepreneurs who have succeeded, they have a set of common experiences, which are success. So for the many entrepreneurs out there who want to learn lessons from them. Do you think that there is a limit to how applicable the experiences of people who have only succeeded, whether they succeeded, quickly, or like Gary Hirschberg, whether they succeeded after quite a lot of setbacks? But is there a limit? Is there a danger in overlearning the lessons of people who succeeded?
No, I mean, I think that first of all, there are plenty of places where people can go to hear about failure only. And I think that failure is such a pivotal, important, central part of what How I Built This is. In fact, I think you could argue that How I Built This is a failure show that obviously is highlighting successful people. The reason why I do that, and the reason why I think it's so important for people to hear from successful people who have failed, is to understand that failure is part of the game and part of the process, right? I mean, what I do on How I Built This is very simple, and what we do with the book is very simple. It's designed very specifically to inspire people to think about their own lives and what they might want to put out into the world. It doesn't have to be a business. It doesn't have to be a world-changing business. It could be a problem that you have and that you want to solve. It could be an HVAC company that provides a better service in your community. It could be a corner store that provides better, more interesting food items. The point really is that we are specifically talking to people who succeeded in order to inspire people to maybe want to pursue something. But the point is that we want people to hear the stories of these people lying on the bathroom floor crying in the fetal position. We want people to hear a Howard Schultz or a Sarah Blakely or a Jamie Siminoff of Ring or a Tristan Walker or any Richard Branson, any of the people who've been on the show, and we want to demythologize them. I don't want people to think of them as superheroes. I want people to understand that there was a time when nobody would pick up their call, when they did think of themselves as failures. I want people to understand that they went through really difficult moments and really struggled in many cases to get to where they are. So while, of course, I think hearing from somebody who just failed and didn't succeed is valuable, there are plenty of places and spaces where people can be exposed to that. But on How I Built This, I try and focus on the series of failures that people had that eventually led to success. It's like Winston Churchill's famous definition of success, which is the endpoint of a series of failures.
In the interest of demythologizing Guy Raz, there's something you say in the book that in 2008, just before you started the Nieman Fellowship at Harvard, you said, "I'd been told by a powerful executive that I didn't have the chops to be a radio host." Tell us about that. Is that person still working in radio?
It's not even about the person. I think for me, it was about, and I think many people have experienced this. You are somebody who you respect or who has a lot of experience in your profession tells you that you can't do something and is an obstacle. And isn't trying to be malicious, but is trying to be very straightforward with you, which was the case. And it's very painful because, especially when you're working one industry, like journalism or news or whatever it might be, you believe that. And it can be a very crushing and painful experience. And in my case, it was kind of the impetus to change my career, to actually leave the world of journalism, because I thought, look, I've poured my heart and soul into this. I started out as a reporter when I was 22, writing articles for the Washington City paper and then the Washington Post, and becoming an NPR reporter at a very young age. And I thought that was, that I would pursue this and do what I wanted to do and continue to grow. And when it became clear to me that I couldn't, I left for a year to do this fellowship. The reality is that had that not happened in my life, I wouldn't be doing this today. So that failure and a series of many failures in my career that really hurt me and wounded me and at times made me think that I was finished as a reporter, as a journalist. Those were blessings. I mean, I'm not religious, so I shouldn't use that word, but those were actually really important, pivotal things that happened to me because they were kind of a kick in the butt. They forced me to think about my career and how to kind of take control over it. And so, despite the pain and the challenges of those times and those experiences, I'm very thankful for them every day, because without them, I wouldn't have grown.
You're obviously still a journalist, but you are a journalist who became an entrepreneur. You certainly weren't that early in your career. What's it like making that transition?
You know, I would also hesitate calling myself a journalist. I mean, I of course do work that is journalism adjacent, but I'm not reporting in the way that I used to as a reporter. I really, I think that what I do now is I try and convene conversations that really tease out honest and true and vulnerable stories from people that I hope are helpful for people who listen to the show, and I hope people get a lot out of it. But you're right. I have a production company. We work with NPR. I also make a children's program. We have a children's production company. It's great. It's a really wonderful experience to be able to do that. I get to work with incredible people, and I get to do the kind of work that I love to do, but also feel fairly independent.
We're going to we have a bunch of great questions from the people who are watching, so I want to get to those in just a minute, but wanted to ask you one more question. You talk about the relationship between research and instincts when you're starting a company. What is that relationship? What's the proper role of those two things in finding your product or your market?
I mean, I think it goes back to this idea of answering the question: what is the problem I see in the world, and what's my role in solving it? And it can be a problem that you have no experience in initially. I mean, here's an example. Nancy Twine, she was a young trader at Goldman Sachs, and was doing what you do as a young trader at Goldman Sachs. And her mother was tragically killed in an automobile accident when Nancy was in her mid-20s. And he was going through her mother's papers and discovered her mother was a doctor, a pediatrician, and also a chemist. And Nancy was going through her mother's papers and discovered that her mom was working on skin lotions and different beauty products just on the side. And she was inspired to leave her job and to create something, but she wanted to solve a problem. Nancy is a Black woman who felt that there were not good hair care products for her hair that were natural, non-toxic, and organic. So she decided to create her own line. I mean, she did it with very little money. She spent almost 2 years researching this industry, and then eventually, with a tiny bit of seed money that she had saved, launched Briogeo, and stayed, by the way, at Goldman Sachs for 2 years while she was launching this brand. It's now the fastest selling product at Sephora and Ulta, and is a really amazing story. So, I mean, I think that she had the instinct, which was, I have a problem, but she also, had to spend a great deal of time kind of researching this industry that she had no clue how to even get into. She was on the show a few months ago, and it's one of my favorite stories because I think that we can relate to that. We are all in some ways Nancy Twines. We all have a problem, and sometimes we don't know how to begin to solve it. But with time, research, and dedication, I mean, you in theory, you can solve a problem that is manageable. Not everybody's going to figure out how to get us to the moon, but how to come up with a hair care product that works, that is manageable. That is something that you can imagine trying to do.
Actually, before we go to questions from people who are watching, I had one more that I want to ask you. You said in the book, you talking about issues of access and advantage and exclusion that a lot of people will face in trying to start their business. You concluded by saying it's never been easier to make this journey than it is right now. basically whoever you are, for everyone, it's never been easy to make this journey than it is right now. Obviously, you wrote that before COVID shut down the economy. Certainly, there probably have been sometimes it's been easier than right now. But
Well, I would,
also,
yeah, I mean, good.
well, I was going to say also the formation rate of new businesses has been falling in America for I think a couple decades actually. So I'm wondering what made you why do you say that it's never been easier than it is now?
Well, you're right. I mean, entrepreneurship, if you think about an entrepreneur as a plumber or a contractor or somebody who runs a small business, the height of entrepreneurship in the United States was really in the 70s and late 60s. And it's been declining over the decades, as you rightly point out. Part of that has to do with access to healthcare and the fact that big companies provide healthcare and more people work for big organizations. But I think that it stands. I mean, today, in terms of standing up a business, and by the way, I was a foreign correspondent who lived overseas for 7 years and reported from more than 50 countries. There are very few countries on earth where it is easier to start a business than the United States. And I'm not saying we're not a flawed country. We are incredibly flawed, and especially now. But there's a reason why millions of people, including my parents, came to this country to start a business, because it was possible. And so the idea that it's never been easier to start a business now than ever before, it still stands. It is still easier. The other side to it is that, as you know, there's an estimated $1 trillion of unspent capital sitting with private equity and venture capital firms in America today. There is a lot of money that is waiting to be invested in people. And while it doesn't mean it's easy to get that money, it is available. And so I also think that, with the internet and with manufacturing costs that are relatively comparatively low, it's incredibly easy compared to what it was 20, 30 years ago. Imagine you're Nancy Twine 20 years ago and you want to start a hair care products company. You couldn't just do that. I mean, look at somebody like Kylie Jenner, obviously with incredible advantages of fame, but she created a white labeled cosmetics company. Cosmetics brands are essentially made in 5 or 6 places around the country now. And many, many, many young entrepreneurs are basically going to these white label manufacturers and creating cosmetics companies. You couldn't do that 10, 20 years ago. So I think without a doubt in my mind, it's easier to start a business today than ever before, because we have so much more access to information that we didn't have. I'm old enough to remember when we didn't have the internet. So I think that's what makes this moment, as challenging as it is and as difficult as it is for many people, it's also a really inspiring time.
Great. Well, let's go to a couple of questions from that have been submitted in advance. First question we have is from William, who asked, can you describe your approach to research before each show? You talked a little bit about this, but tell us what goes into one of these deep conversations.
Yeah, so first of all, we do a lot of research before we even approach somebody to be on the show. We want to make sure that, as I said earlier, they represent the best of entrepreneurship. And I have a conversation with everybody who comes on the show, and I explain the process, and I explain how long it's going to take, and that we basically have no conditions. That you have to accept that if you're willing to go on the show. And from there, we have a small team, but we do extensive research. So we gather everything that's available publicly, but we also have access to non-public databases. So we even do background checks. We do criminal background checks of everybody who's on the show. Not to embarrass them or scare them, but because it's a contextualized show and we're telling a 360-degree story of somebody's life, we want to make sure that if we come across something that is, strange or odd or challenging, that we're able to talk about it with the person. I mean, a good example is Steve Madden. He went to jail for securities fraud. And we had to talk about that and talked about it in great depth. And it was really interesting because he could reflect on this experience and how stupid he was, and essentially said to us he was greedy. And so we do, as I say, both we find public information, and we also have access to non-public information. And so I spend a lot of time. Oftentimes, I know the person's story better than they do when I go into an interview.
You ever had anyone walk out being asked about something they didn't want to talk about?
No, because we don't beg people to be on the show. We want people to come in a spirit of generosity. I mean, we are asking you to share your most challenging moments in life. And we ask you to do that because we're serving 3.5 million people who listen to our show every week, who have Etsy shops, who have small businesses, who are looking for ideas and inspiration, and also want to understand what the mistakes that that person made. So I'm an avatar for our listeners. My role is to have these conversations that my listeners don't have access to. And so we're very clear with people. We don't want you to come on unless you are absolutely fully invested in coming on and sitting down with me for 3 hours at least and having this conversation. And if you don't want to, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
The next question we have is from Sherry and Yvonne and others as well, who asked, are there specific characteristics that stand out across the board with the entrepreneurs you've interviewed? This is definitely something that you get at in the book, but what jumps to mind?
I'll talk about one of my favorite ones, which is rejection, the ability to withstand rejection. I am really interested in, we've had several, this is a really interesting case study. We've had several Mormon entrepreneurs on the show. And if you talk to them, what ties them all together is they will tell you, I went on a 2-year mission somewhere around the world. Now, at age 19, many young Mormon men and women are sent somewhere around the world to knock on doors and spread the word, right? They're trying to get converts. It's a form of salesmanship. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm trying to explain what they do. And if you are a Mormon missionary, you're getting 900 doors slammed in your face for every 1,000 you're knocking on. And they have to be polite and gracious and kind and carry on and move forward. And what it means is that for 2 years, they're essentially undergoing a form of rejection exposure therapy, right? And when they come back to the United States at age 21, a lot of these kids are really in a much better position to kind of take on the world. Now, I'm not saying you have to be a Mormon missionary to develop the skills. The point of that is to say, having access or an experience where you are rejected again and again actually builds the kind of resilience you will need to start a business. Because, putting an idea out into the world automatically means that you're going to hear from people who say, it's not going to work, or what's the point? I mean, you're going to hear from cynical journalists who are going to say, well, what about this, or what about that? And you're going to hear a lot of no's. And so your job is to be able to understand that that's part of the process, that you're going to withstand that, and you're going to push forward, and eventually you will get to yeses. And so I think developing the ability to withstand rejection is what binds all of these entrepreneurs together, and it's a learned trait.
The cynical journalists, we're just trying to help entrepreneurs learn that trait faster, really.
Exactly.
The next question we have is from Clint. Clint asks, Guy, what's the #1 best advice you have for a listener right now that wants to start their own profitable media business in the podcasting space? Thanks.
It's a great question. I mean, I think about it really simply. Everybody has about 16 hours of waking time during the day, right? And most of that time is spent working. We have 2, 3, 4 maybe hours to ourselves. And you're cooking, you're chopping vegetables, maybe you're commuting. Obviously, we're not commuting as much now. You're exercising. And the way I think about the shows I do, whether it's How I Built This or Wisdom from the Top or the Rewind on Spotify or Wow in the World or whatever show I'm doing, I think about that time that person is giving me. And if they're going to give me an hour of their time, I have to make it value added for them because I have limited time. And when I listen to a show, a podcast, or consume media, I want it to be worth my time. I want to be able to walk away from that and say, that was great. That was really worth my time. And so I really spend a lot of time thinking about the people who are going to listen to the show and work really hard to make sure that what I'm asking for an hour of your time, I'm going to give it to you for free, but I'm asking you for an hour of your time, which is a big ask. And so if you're going to give me that hour of your time, which is really valuable, I promise you, I'm going to work really hard to make it worthwhile for you. And I think that's how you should think about approaching the content that you create.
There's a chapter in the book about building word of mouth, and your conclusion about how to build word of mouth is have a great product, which is kind of funny because it sounds, it's easier said than done. Is that the irreducible part of all of this? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of things here where, like location, maybe you're better off being in New York, maybe you're better off being in Ottawa, but is having a great product the one part that's non-negotiable?
I think that it is. I mean, I don't think it's the only way to engineer word of mouth, because you can have a Tupperware party and engineer word of mouth, right? You can invite your friends over and be part of some like multi-level marketing scheme and engineer word of mouth. But it goes back to this theory that Seth Godin has. Seth Godin is one of the best known marketing gurus, and it's the purple cow theory. If you're driving through the countryside, and you see a cow eating grass in a pasture, you're not going to stop your car. But if it's a purple cow, you're going to stop your car, going to get out and take a picture of that cow and tell all your friends about it. And I think it's why brands like Tesla or even shoes like Allbirds have been very successful in word of mouth marketing, because people like those products. And despite whatever you may think about them, people who have those products tend to talk about them. And in the world of marketing, I didn't come up with this, I didn't make this up. Word of mouth marketing, information from a trusted source is like the holy grail of marketing.
We have a question from Michael, who asks, out of all the interviews that you've conducted, which ones had the biggest impact on how you view the relationship between life and business, and why?
Oh man, so many. But I think the interview I did with Tariq Farid probably really opened that up. I mean, he started a company that no one watching this would ever have invested in, Edible Arrangements. If somebody went to you 25 years ago and said, hey, Jeff, I have this great idea. I want to cut up cantaloupe and melon and strawberries and craft them in the shape of flowers, put them on sticks and arrange them in a bouquet and deliver them to people's doors, you would say, that's the dumbest idea I ever heard, and I am not interested in investing in that. And that's what everybody said to Tariq Farid. But today it's a company valued at more than $500 million, and he really built an incredible empire. But along with building that business, as he was very honest on the show, his marriage collapsed. And for many years, he was estranged from his children because he was so focused on his business and on building it. And that happens. And we want to bring that to light on the show because we want to understand some of the decisions and sacrifices people make when they're starting a business. I will say today, Tariq is now reconciled with his children. I think some of them work with him. But it's really important to remember that, this is not, these people on the show are not, they're not sort of fleeting from success to success, and in some cases have great challenges in their personal lives, and regret those challenges.
Michael, I don't know if this is the same Michael, but we have another question from several of the viewers. Michael Stone and others asked, of all the entrepreneurs you've talked to, who's someone who surprised you the most? Who's someone who is different than you assumed they would be before you talk to them?
I mean, in a sense, I'm surprised. This is sort of a cop-out, but I'm surprised by everybody I interview because I come into an interview with expectations, right? But I'm sitting down with people for 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours. And there's no way. It's like, do you remember that New York Times article that came out a couple of years ago, the 20 questions that make you fall in love with somebody? I mean, it's a bit of a version of what I'm doing. Obviously, I don't, I'm trying to tease out a story that is going to be a true story. But when you know somebody's story very intimately and in a granular way, you can't help but understand them in a deeper way. It doesn't mean that you fall in love with them, but it means that you know things and nuances about them that you wouldn't know as a casual follower of them or just passing them by on the street. mean, I think that, in general, you know, there's a version of everybody I talk to that is different than what I expect, because over the course of the interview, our conversation deepens naturally. When you're sitting down with somebody, the first hour you're getting to know them, the second hour you're getting to know them better, and by hour three, they trust you, and I trust them. I have to, because I need them to tell me an honest story. So I hear and see different versions of people over the course of that time. I mean, I was really, one example that I loved was I interviewed Kate Spade. It was the last major interview she did before she tragically died. And she was so delightful. I mean, you think of Kate Spade and that iconic brand and her name all over the world, and she sold her company 20 years ago. I mean, she didn't even own her own name, but she was a huge force in the world of fashion. I mean, she transformed American handbags, purses. She really was a force, and just a delightful and self-effacing and kind and warm person. And of course I was crushed when she died, because even though I only interviewed her once, and it was an intense experience. So I would say she's an example of somebody who really did surprise me. She was not in any way a high fashion priestess. She was, but she was a really wonderful, kind, funny person, the kind of person you'd want to have over for a dinner party and to just talk to, because that's who she was.
We have one more question. It's from UN, and the question is, what keeps you motivated every day to do what you do?
I mean, I get letters and social media messages and comments from people every single day, multiple times a day, and it's a version of this. I am writing to you because I started a business 2 years ago, and about 2 months ago, I almost shut it down because I was struggling and I was freaking out. And I went for a run and I heard this episode, whatever episode of How I Built This, and I started to cry because I related to that person's story so much. And I decided I was going to continue, and I wanted to thank you and the team for bringing these stories to me. Now, I know that sounds a little bit hokey, and if I heard that 5 years ago, I would have thought, this is hokey. It's very real. We hear that hundreds of times a week, and there's nothing that motivates me more than that. Because especially now when we're in this difficult time, knowing that people come to the show and what I do and what our team does for that motivation, that boost, it's absolutely crucial to me. We need to have that in the world. And so that's what I bring. It's not the beginning, middle, and end, but it's a small role that I play for our listeners. And that's really what gets me out of bed every day.
Great. Well, as you can probably tell from the gathering dusk behind me in my office, we have used up all the time that we have for this delightful conversation. So I want to, first of all, thank everyone who's watching us and remind you that you can get a signed copy of How I Built This from our bookseller, Pages, a bookstore. And I want to thank you, Guy Raz, for a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Jeff.
Well, really enjoyed this, and hope everybody watching has a great night.
Bye.